And welcome, everybody. This is Major League Commander Weekly. I am Callahan, and also joining me today for this show is my friend Lazergician. How are you doing today?
I'm pretty good. Glad to be on the channel. Glad to be representing yet another long-haired nerd talking about Magic.
Absolutely. Well, part of why he is joining me is what Major League Commander Weekly is we're going to do a weekly recap of the MLC league that is running on the r/competitive EDH server. But before we jump into all of that, I just want to thank all of you for joining us this week. If you like this episode or any of our other episodes here on the Mind Sculptors channel, please make sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below. If you want access to our Discord server, as well as some extra content, make sure to head on over to our Patreon at patreon.com/themindsculptors. Check out the link in the description. We also have a TCG player affiliate link, which I have yet to add to our script. And if you are going to be buying some cards, go ahead and click on that link down there, and you can help out the channel through that means. So Laser is actually going to be the host of this show generally. So I'm just going to hand it over to him and we'll go from there.
Awesome. So first things first, it's kind of hard to talk about the MLC unless we really know what it is. So we're going to do a quick rundown on the format of Major League Commander. It is a 12-week league, the same way any other traditional sport may be or structured, where we're going to draft a whole bunch of decks among a whole bunch of players, and they're going to play each other over the course of these 12 weeks. Callahan, tell us a little bit about how we can expect things to look over the next couple months.
Yeah, so the way everything is going to be is it's a 12-week league. Everybody's got 2 bye weeks, and it's a predetermined schedule. So everybody has, I think it's at minimum 2 home games. I think a handful of people got 3 because of how the schedule shook out.
Where a home game means they are player number 1 in turn order.
Correct. So if you're a home player, you go first in the turn order. That's a guaranteed first. And then everybody else rolls to see who goes second, third, and fourth. And so all of the who you're playing, all of that is determined. And there's a schedule that you can actually go see with time slots and everything.
Yeah, if you want any of that, there's a bunch of places you can look. I imagine Callahan will probably have some sort of schedule public within some format at some point. So keep an eye out for that if you want to follow along over the course of all these weeks.
Absolutely.
Another interesting thing is that you've structured this, again, pretty similarly to traditional sports. I'm thinking baseball, I'm thinking football, in that we have different divisions and different conferences that we are using to divide up the players to see who's going to play who.
Yeah, I tried to do it as much regionally as possible, and part of what that decision was going into is really leaning into I've said this on Twitter a lot, is I said, like, the NFL, Major League Baseball, and the NBA, like, they've figured it out, right? Like, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Just take their formula and bring it to Magic. And so that's what I'm kind of attempting to do here with this, is bringing kind of that NBA consistency and charm, all of that stuff here to Magic, and making Commander really exciting.
You know what? Part of what's exciting about that is you get those regional rivalries. You get to know the matchups between different teams over the course of a season, over the course of a franchise's existence. Kind of similarly, we're sort of trying to create that drama, those storylines, by the way we're organizing all the divisions. So let's start with the Western Conference. We're split up into Pacific, Southwest, Midwest, and South divisions. Yeah,
so in the Pacific division, we've got Securia, who's actually from Porto, Portugal. But he's filling in for a player who was originally going to be in the league but had to drop out at the last minute, and it was much easier to fill somebody into a slot than to reorganize the entire league structure. So Securia, he will be in the Pacific Division, followed by Sage from Sage of Fables. They're out of San Francisco, California. Josh from Second Seven MTG. He is from San Diego, California. And a name a lot of people ought to know is Cameron from the Lab Maniacs up from Seattle, Washington.
Yeah, Cameron is coming out of retirement, having sworn off at least competitive EDH, and I think, if I remember correctly, Magic as a whole for a while. He's coming in to pinch hit for the Lab Maniacs, so I'm really excited for that, actually. I cut my teeth in cEDH on Lab Maniacs content, so that to me is really exciting.
My very first cEDH deck was Dan and Siggy's Paradox Storm list. And ever since then, I've been hooked on cEDH. They are the reasons I'm here today. Well, so it's really exciting to get to work with them.
With Callahan outing themselves as a degenerate in every form of the word, let's take a look at the Southwest Division. First up, we got Higher from cEDH Nexus out of San Diego. Beautiful place. I worked there for a little while. Amazing.
Yeah.
Next up is Fukins coming out of Albuquerque. Am I pronouncing that right? Fukins?
I think that's correct.
Okay, cool. I'm not trying to get us...
I think that's correct.
You know what? Let's just demonetize ourselves immediately with any other way to pronounce that. Third is going to be Ken, representing Stacked EDH out of Santa Fe. And lastly, we got LJ from the Reflecting Pool in Clarksville. So what do you make of this pool?
This is an interesting group of people. You've got Hire, who is a cEDH vet. One deck that I think a lot of people would know him from is Kenrith Midrange, which
Absolutely.
is on the database. He is a big proponent of those sorts of evolution style decks. Fukins is newer, but he's made a lot of splashes here in the last few Time Twisted tournaments. And so he kind of got invited based on that. Ken, of course, is a content creator, which, believe it or not, this might not be known to everybody, but he used to be an actor. And in his previous career, his role was Ben on the TV show The Secret Life of an American Teenager.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
That's so cool.
So he is by far the most famous person in our league.
That's okay. You know what? That's really neat. I didn't know that.
Not very many people do.
How about LJ?
LJ is from the Reflecting Pool, like you said, and LJ is really, really well known in the community as an Edric player. He runs the Edric list on the database. And so those are the type of decks that he really likes to run. He's had some success with them too. So it's not a deck that you really see a lot, but it's a deck that, he's had some real great success with.
I mean, hey, there's really something to be said for familiarity and expertise.
Absolutely.
Which is something we'll touch on a little later when we talk about the fieldable decks. But first up, we still got a whole bunch more people to go over, starting with the Midwest Division. There we got Phoenix from the Mind Sculptors, Snacks, Nick representing the Tryhards, and Deke from the cEDH Nexus.
Yeah. So Phoenix, both Phoenix and Snacks are good friends of mine, actually. They are here from the local cEDH scene here in Lincoln, Nebraska, where the three of us live. And Snacks won our local cEDH league, which had 50-some people in it. He won the very first season of it. And he's a really good player. He's plays a lot of Razzacats, Food Chain, those sorts of things. So he's a really good player, one of the better players I've actually seen in my time, as well as Phoenix. And Phoenix has been a big friend of mine here. And honestly, he's probably, in my opinion, the Spleen Face everybody knows is the best player in cEDH right now. I would say Phoenix is a close two. Those are probably who I would say are the two best players in cEDH, in my opinion.
What a heck of an endorsement.
Yeah, hopefully I'm not overselling him, but he's a very talented player. and he can play whatever you put in front of him. Nick from the Tryhards, they're doing the Mean 16 right now over there on the Tryhards, and Nick kind of does a little bit of everything, but my understanding is he's a big control mid-range player, really favors Elsha. So it's interesting kind of what he does. And Deke is somebody I actually don't know a whole lot about, but he is from the cEDH Nexus, is friends with Scoots and all those guys, and very good player. So it'll be interesting to see what that Midwest Conference does.
Yeah, speaking of conferences, we got the South coming up next with Flash Andretti from RCEDH, along with Infinite IMOC. Is that an acronym, or am I just supposed to pronounce it out? You know what? Who knows?
I just pronounce it out, so.
IMOC it is. Rounding out the division is Hellenium from the Spellseekers, along with either Hokey or Hockey rules. I think Hokey.
It's Hokey.
Hokey, it's awesome.
Hokey. Yeah, so Hal in Hokey, I mean, Hokey's kind of a honorary Spellseeker, but Hal, again, is a big evolution player, just like Hire, and Hokey is the resident Godo player. So if you really want some great Godo ideas and stuff like that, if you expect to see Godo coming out of this league, it's probably going to be Hokey. Flash Andretti's
Godo players think? I thought they just count to 11.
Well, evidently these days they have to do a little bit more thinking than they used to. So it's interesting.
Man, it's hard to be a red mage out here these days.
Evidently. But yeah, like Infinite IMOC and Flash, they're, moderators and game masters over on the RCDH Nexus, or excuse me, RCDH Discord server. And I've got the Slam games with Flash. I don't think I've played with IMOC, but they're very good players, endorsed by Pongo and Shaper and some of those guys. So they're here representing the South.
Well, speaking of some of those guys, Pongo is actually representing our first division in the Eastern Conference, which is the North Division. He is joined by Pontus, Play M, and Coinman.
Yeah. So Coinman, people might know he's been kind of a figure in the cEDH community for a really long time. And so is Pongo. Pontus does a lot of stuff with the cEDH TV people, with Ondus and Playem as well. So Playem is probably the most, has seen the most success. We've talked a lot about evolution players so far in the Western Conference. Playem has had probably the most success with it, as he's won Time Twisted, I believe it was 4, playing Sans Black Evolution. And I fully expect him to be on some sort of that nonsense in this league.
Makes a lot of sense. Next up is going to be the division I am most interested in, the Northeast Conference. We got Lurker from RCDH and Ian from Comedian MTG, both representing my hometown up in Boston. We got Scoots up in New York, and Spleenface, again, a very popular name over in Toronto.
Yep. So that's the division that's going to be the hardest to get out of.
That's the Killers division for sure.
Yeah, that's Lurker is, everybody knows Lurker, one of the masters of deck building. Ian has had a ton of tournament success here recently, and Spleenface, as we know, has had his fair share of tournament success recently as well. And Scoots kind of took a break from Magic for a little bit, but he's back. And honestly, he's like, if I could think of 4 of the best players to put in a pod together 2 times in a year, it would be these 4.
I mean, every league is going to end up with at least one group of death, right? So it's no surprise we got one too.
Yeah, you got the NFC West in football, and everybody's got them. So it'll be interesting. This might be the NFC West of the MLC.
I'll take your word for it. As more of a league player, I'm thinking every group TSM has ever gotten at Worlds, because I'm an apologist and don't want to admit that we're just bad. Next up, we got the Atlantic Division. Moving down a little bit, we got Rebel Sun out of Brooklyn, very popular sentient AI. We got Kai representing the Spellseekers, Brayden from the cEDH cast, and Charles, another Sculpty boy.
Yeah, we've got several Sculpty boys representing here in Charles, who is the mono white guy. So you might see some low color white decks floating around.
Because anyone else is going to draft those.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting. There are going to be some extra decks. So, and I think we're going to talk about that later, but it'll be interesting to see how it all goes. Kai is a control player, mid-range player, somewhere in there. He's a very good player. We've got to play with him a handful of times. Braden, everybody knows from the cEDH cast. He loves Turbo, Nas, Paco, and Halden. He also worked on Medium Green, but Corvold is his baby. So something like that. And then Rebel, everybody knows Rebel because of Sisay.
Yeah, I love that Sisay deck. I actually think that one is so cool.
It's a really good deck. I really enjoy that. It's like Najeela light. It's really cool.
See, hearing that reaction is why I'm a garbage player. I'm like, yeah, that deck is sick. It does so many weird, funky things. And you're over here like, yeah, it's really strong. It wins games very frequently. This is why I'm not playing, people. Listen now.
I'm also not playing for a reason, but that's also because I would just pick bad decks.
Well, someone needs to be the evil overlord pulling all the strings. And if it's going to be someone...
Evidently it's me.
Yeah, let's round out the divisions with the Central Eastern Conference division. First up, we got Sicko Robot. I know it's Sick Robot, but I one time misread it as Sicko Robot and have never been able to correct it in my head. So for the rest of forever, is this where we make a Travis Scott joke for Sicko mode or something like that? Well, I think this is where we like take a robot and just give it like a big old Flava Flav gold chain and make a graphic out of that.
I love it.
Tweet your fan mail at what's your Twitter handle? At Callahan is here, I think. Whatever Callahan's Twitter handle is, go meme him with Sicko Robot stuff. Next up is Devonte from the Reflecting Pool, Timmy T1000 from Budget Brews, and rounding out our esteemed panel of players is Squirrel Mob out of East Lansing playing for Possibility Storm.
Yeah, another really great group of people. You know, I play a lot with Sick Robot. He's really, really good. He's the Hulk proprietor. I've never got to play with Devonte, but he's also a strong player as well. Timmy T1000 is kind of one of the veteran players in this group. He's been around for a while, and he loves some Consult Scepter Thrasios. And then Squirrel Mob, he's just a really good all-around player. I fully expect him to be on some sort of Reanimator nonsense or something like that.
And with that is the rundown of our players, divisions, and conferences completed. We've talked a little bit about the decks we expect them to draft, but first I want to talk a little bit about what to consider when we're drafting cEDH decks.
Yeah. So when we're drafting these decks, there's a couple things to keep in mind. So one, we're going by the tabs on the database. So, there's only one Najeela Tempo tab. And so that means that there will only be one Najeela Tempo deck in this format. So, if you were to go into a normal tournament, you could expect that you would see some number of Najeela decks, some number of like Roger Silas decks, and then like other sorts of things, right? Well, in this, because it's limited to one per style or one per archetype and deck, you're not going to have that. So there's going to be much more of a plurality in what you're going to see. So when you're going and drafting these, in my opinion, you want to have like 2 to 3 core decks, and then one deck that you feel comfortable with, but maybe aren't as experienced with, something that you think you could do okay with. But your first pick ought to be a deck that you think you are going to be really, really good on. Either a deck you're super comfortable with and really and think is very powerful, or a deck that is just the most powerful thing that is available and can kind of,
one that you trust you can pick up.
Yeah, like some decks kind of pilot themselves. And so like there's some decks where you need it relies a lot on the player's ability to play the deck. And some decks, it rewards that, but just, it needs a competent pilot to function. And these are all competent pilots. So, they could hit, any of the best decks. So that would be what I want for my first deck. The second deck would be what I would call an anti-meta deck, which would be a deck that's going to attack the decks that are going to be in this format. So this would be where you draft your stacks deck. Something along the lines of Blood Pod, 5-color control with Kenrith, any of those sorts of decks that are going to, rule of law decks. Stuff that's going to attack decks that are going to want to cast a lot of spells.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of players are going to be really comfortable at this point on like the breach line decks, decks that, like you said, are trying to spam out spells really, really quickly.
Right.
And there's surprisingly a good amount of decks that can hate on that, but not as many as you would think.
There's not.
So making sure you have one of those where you really, if you know that everyone in your pod for the week is really comfortable with breach lines, ad nause lines, peer into the abyss lines, having something in your back pocket to hate on that can be really effective.
Especially if you're the home player. If you have, if you are the home player and you are like, I really, really don't want to be on any sort of NOS strategy because that's not the game plan I like playing, and I don't feel comfortable doing that, and I don't think I'm going to succeed with that. This is where you are going to want to use that I know I'm going first 2 times over the course of the season, and you want to use that to your advantage and find the deck that is going to punish players the most when you're going first. But you could also flip that into what I would also kind of have as your third type of deck that you want to have. Maybe it should be the first. I don't know. There's no particular order. These 3, I guess, is a deck that is the best home game deck that you can possibly imagine. These are decks like Najeela, Rog Silas, those sorts of things that just have such a huge advantage going first.
They hit the gas pedal, they stick on it as hard as they can. They go from turn number 1.
Absolutely. And it just makes your decks that mulligan well, things like that can go really quickly. That's what you want as a really good home game deck.
Is there one deck on the database that sticks out to you as a home game deck? Because for me, I'm looking at Najeela as an excellent home game deck.
I think it's probably the best overall deck in the format.
Yeah, there's overall. That too. There's that.
I think it's the best deck in this format, but I think the best home game deck is probably Rograk Silas Turbonas.
Yep.
And the reason for that is it just, even if your opponents are prepared for it, they have to mulligan really aggressively to stop you. And, that deck mulligans fairly well, and, you'll be able to mulligan to some sort of obnoxious turn 1 that's enabled by having your commander on turn 1 every game and just run away with it. Now, this is a deck that you can't play really in any other seat because people are going to be able to hate it really hard, and it gets progressively worse the farther in the turn order it gets. So drafting it is a little bit of a liability because of the fact that you can't play it outside of your home games. But it is a deck that I would strongly consider if I was looking for a really good home game deck.
So here's a question for you regarding drafting decks. Are there any restrictions on how many times you can play a deck, how many times you must play a deck, anything like that you need to take into consideration?
So everybody has to play their decks, every deck that they have at least once, but can play them no more than 3 times over the course of the season. So every deck has like a minimum pitch hit threshold it's got to get, and then like a maximum play threshold. But once you get to the playoffs, you pick one deck and you lock it in.
So does that influence anything to you? Because to me, one of the most interesting things about this format is that week to week, there is a limited pool of decks that you might face. So if you've crafted your lineup pretty well, you happened to listen to this episode and happened to think, that Callahan person really knows what they're talking about. I should probably have one of each of these kinds of decks. What kind of considerations do you make when you have your lineup sitting in front of you and you have a pool of decks that you're staring down coming up in the next week? How do you make the determination this deck is the one that I need to run?
Well, it's going to come down to a combination of things. One, it's going to be what you anticipate the turn order to be. So it's very nice that you're either going to be home or away. So, you're either going first or you're not. Now, whether or not you're going second, third, or fourth is a little bit of a, it's a die roll. But if I'm not going first, so my opponents, what I think is their fastest deck, their best deck out of the gate. And so you want to pick a deck that is going to be good against that, but you also want to make sure that you aren't picking something that your opponents can also just shut down too, because you're playing against 3 people. So it's kind of a hard balancing act. This is where probably, and this is why I expect mid-range decks to just dominate this format, because mid-range decks are the best tooled to deal with a variety of things. So like a mid-range deck, like I think like Razakats is a really good example of like the mid-range deck right now, is a deck that no matter what seat at the table it is, it's going to be a threat at the table. And it's going to be able to deal with most everything, and it's going to be able to get its game going fairly decently no matter what table or what seat position it's sitting at. And those are considerations that I would take into account. The way the league is formatted, it does make me, if I was playing in it, a little hesitant to grab stuff like Lavinia Omen Pool, just because, which is my deck, but just because of the fact that I know that it's going to be really, really good only 2 times a year, and then the rest of the year it's going to be okay or really bad, because Omen Pool is really bad in last.
So it sounds to me kind of like you're saying it makes sense to have one high ceiling explosive proactive deck for when you're at home, one or two kind of adaptive mid-rangey decks for when you just need to be a presence at the table, need to make yourself a threat, but also need a little bit of flexibility to combat someone else being that go hard mode home game deck. And then it's good to have one more reactive, Staxy, Haiti deck for when you really need it for a certain pod.
Yeah. And there are certain pods where, if you're going first and you really want a good turn 1 deck, you're going to have a handful of Stax decks that are going to be really good, but you have to balance whether or not, and it's going to depend on what part of the season you're home in too, right? Because you might not get a home game until week 6. And so there's just like a weird variety of things that like go into it. Because, if you already have like a handful of wins and you go to your home game, you're like, okay, well, I'm playing up against 3 people who I also know, or one person in particular that I know I really don't want to win this. So I'm probably going to pick a deck that's going to attack that harder than maybe the other 2 decks at the table. And that's where it'll be really interesting to see how the players handle that dynamic.
Yeah, there's some really neat predictive mind games that go in, especially when you consider that players will have available information on whether or not a deck has been played yet from a certain player. So let's say I'm on, this isn't in the pool, but it's a very boom or bust deck, so it makes a good example. Let's say I'm a home game player and I have not played Birgi Storm yet. You know what that deck is doing.
You're pretty confident that's what you're going to be playing that week.
So it makes a lot of sense to tailor that because you have that knowledge that that deck needs to be played. Then there's that additional level of the scheduling that comes in that can help inform your decisions too. So I think one of the coolest parts about this format for a league is how many factors can go into deciding what you play from week to week.
Yeah, it's going to be really exciting. And I think, some of the players that we know of being really, really good strategists like Spleenface, Rebel, Sick, Scoots, those types of people, Pongo. Those are the people that I expect to very, very, like, really think very deeply about their deck decisions from week to week, and I expect them to be the most thoughtful when they're picking their decks.
Meanwhile, I would just get every teamer deck that I can get my hands on and call it a day. But because I am rightfully not drafting any of this, because I would draft like hot garbage, let's take a look at what you think is going to be a relatively reasonable expectation for the first 10 picks. I understand you did basically a mock draft for yourself to kind of think about what the first 10 or so picks might look like.
Yeah, so LJ from the Reflecting Pool does have the first pick in the draft. And this is going to be, if this ends up being the pick, it's going to be very, very hotly contested. Because I fully expect him to pick Edric Churns in that first pick. Whether or not, we can argue whether or not picking your pet deck when you're going first is the correct decision or not. When there's stuff like Rog Silas, Najeela, Razakats, all that stuff that is available to take. But I fully expect to see Edric Churns go number 1. That's not an indication of whether or not it's the best deck or not. That's just LJ's bread and butter. And word on the street is LJ has full intentions of drafting Edric pick 1, round 1.
And for what it's worth, when we say best deck, we mean in this format in the league.
Right.
There's going to be, if you don't have that context, there will be a lot of hot takes.
Yeah. This is all confined. This isn't like a greater CD. Like, I would not use any of the information in this league as a way to like inform yourself going into like a tier 1 con tournament. Yeah. This is a confined space.
and with that said, second in the pick order is Nick, coming from the Tryhards. You expect him to wake up and choose violence with Jessica Ishai Storm.
Jessica Ishai Storm, maybe Elsha Top. Either of those could work. I felt Jessica Ishai right now is a safe pick. It's kind of hot onto the scene. Jessica Ishai. It is a really, really cool deck. And part of what I really think fits Nick's playstyle here is its ability to go from a controlling game plan to a Storm, we're beating you in the face with a bird game plan too. And it's one of those decks that can just punish you by dropping a Shy on turn 1. And everybody just goes, well, I mean, I guess I have to cast into this now.
Yeah, you thought feeding the fish was bad.
Yeah, this makes feeding the fish look like child's play, especially when you have Jessica there to triple its power or the damage it deals.
Yeah, you end up just feeding the instrument of your own demise.
Yeah, it's a really cool deck. I would not be surprised if he also picked Elsha Top, but I fully expect some sort of Jeskai controlling mid-range that can also go off, which is kind of Jeskai's MO, sort of deck from Nick. I've been watching a lot of Tryhards stuff, and Nick seems to really favor Jeskai commander decks.
Right on. I like it. Third in the pick order is higher. I think surprising nobody, you have pegged higher on Kenrith midrange.
Yep. When he saw the draft order, he was like, "Oh, cool! I get my deck," because he knew nobody above him was going to draft it.
I think I just clicked really hard on that, and I'm not sorry.
Oh, it's fine. But Kenrith midrange is his baby. It's Kenrith midrange is to him as Lavinia is to me, and so and the other thing that's really nice and an advantage for him is it's a really, really good deck. Well,
that deck does it all, right? There's no pod where you're looking at your other 3 opponents and say, I cannot play Kenny midrange. Can't do it.
It's very similar to Razakats in that respect. The difference here is going to be your grind game is considerably worse. And what I mean by that is Kenrith can grind, it's just different. Where Razakats, you have Razakats with Tymna and Thrasios, and then like any sort of the Tymna Crom stuff that's going on. Those decks can grind because of the card advantage they're getting out of the zone that they just generate on their own.
Yeah, you get it basically for free.
Right. Kenrith, there is the 5 mana like entry fee, and then you have to dump more mana into it. But the other thing that's really nice is Kenrith can also be a part of your win con. So it's better suited to winning immediately because of its commander than maybe a Razaket's like a Thrasios Tymna or a Tymna Crom deck. But I would say that overall it doesn't grind as well as those decks.
I think that's probably a bang on prediction. Next up in 4 and 5, you have Kai on Roger Silas Turbo Nas, and then Timmy T on Thrasios Tymna.
Yeah, so Kai is kind of a toss-up. I think Kai is going to go a lot of different ways, and it really comes down to what LJ Nick do in 1 and 2. If they do exactly what I expect, then I think Kai would consider Roger Silas at this point. And the reason being is that he really wants to play Esper midrange, is my understanding. Or not Esper midrange, Esper farm. But Roger Silas is a farm deck, and you could argue that it's the best farm deck. And so I would assume if Rog Silas is there, based on some of the conversations I've had, I think he'll take it. I could also fully see him taking Paco and Halden here.
That's the deck one I was looking at. Yeah.
Yeah. He's played that in Time Twisted tournaments here, recently. And he's very good with the deck. His is different than Braden's on the database. But it could go either way. If Rog Silas is still available, I think he takes Rog Silas, and I think that decision is based on you don't want the people below you getting access to this deck. Is really where it comes down to for me. And then Timmy T100 or 1000 is a Thrasios Tymna stan. He's also a Godo player. We've heard him kind of joke with Hoki that he might hate draft Godo because he plays Godo. But my understand from the Godo people is that that's all just a joke, and Timmy will be on Thrasios Tymna, probably CST, just because CST is a classic. I know he has way more experience playing CST than he does for Razakats, but it could be either. So it'll be some sort of Thrasios Tymna nonsense that Timmy drafts.
Yeah, that's one of the neat things about the format is that because we're going strictly by rows in the database, there are several Tymna Thrasios decks that are all equally viable picks. So
there's 3 of them, and they're not too dissimilar from each other.
Yeah, they have, the classic ability to go long because both commanders are value engines. They both have a lot of outs to just draw into a win by accident. So watching those decks go and in what order is really interesting to me, just in like a little microcosm kind of way.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I also think that it's an interesting little like meta like analogy or analysis of how Thrasios and Tymna is still really good, even without Flash.
Surprising nobody. Speaking of surprising nobody, you have Rebel picking Najeela Tempo at number 6. Not surprising, Najeela absurdly strong, particularly in this format. We talked a little bit more about that. And I don't think anyone will begrudge you expecting Najeela Tempo to go out in the top 10.
Yeah, I think it's a top 10 deck. If it were me and I was LJ, I would take it number 1.
Yeah, I almost begrudge you for not putting it top 5.
Well, yes, but it's one of those things where I don't think Nick would want to play it. I know Hire doesn't want to play it. Kai might play it because Kai might throw you a curveball, but Timmy has shown I've not seen him show any interest in Najeela or show that he's played Najeela substantially, but I've seen him play Thrasios Tymna tons.
Right.
So maybe this is all just like this really big, conspiracy to like, hide the fact that people are going to draft Najeela. But like, if I was LJ, I would draft Najeela because I think it's so close to Edric, in its game plan. But it's just like the best deck in the format. But he's probably going to take Edric. And at this point, I think it probably falls to Rebel. And now what Rebel decides to do, now we all know Rebels a really, really good meta predictor. And what she decides to do is going to really come down, is really going to, her pick is what I consider to be the linchpin of the entire draft. Because if those first 5 picks go that way, what she decides is going to vastly change the outcome of who picks what next. If she picks Najeela Tempo, I think things are pretty by the books from there forward. If she doesn't pick Najeela Tempo and Najeela falls, I don't expect Playem, Ken, or Hokie to pick it. So then it comes to Scoots, and then I would expect Scoots to take that, which pushes Razakets farther down. And then the people, I think if she doesn't take Najeela, some of these really, really good players that are in the middle of the draft order are going to get their pet decks.
And, there's definitely something to be said for, if you're not even really hate drafting, if you're still comfortable with something, even if it might not be your bread and butter, there is a certain kind of deck that's just worth picking off of raw power level.
Yeah, this is 100% one of those decks. It rewards playing the deck a lot and knowing the deck, but it also is just good enough to win on its own.
Look,
so it's
sometimes
one of those
5-color ability activations go burr and you won your round.
I mean, it's about as close to an aggro deck as this format can get. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
so
no, that's entirely true.
It's just it's the best deck in the format, and I think 5 people are going to pass it off, and then if Rebel, it gets to her, I think she's smart enough to know that she doesn't want Scoots or Lurker or Pongo. But if Pongo gets it, it's the end of the world. But I'll eat my shorts if Pongo gets to eat Najeela or play Najeela. But
all right, everyone drafting, you know what you have to do.
Evidently, but that's kind of how I expect it. Hokie at 7 taking Godo. That's like, the sun's going to rise in the east and set in the west.
Yeah, after that, you got Playem on Sans Black Evolution. I think, to me, if I actually was doing this and taking it seriously and not memeing by being Mr. Teamer, I think I would prioritize the Evolution decks pretty heavily because their entire backbone is card quality, right? The entire premise of the deck was, what if we just play 100 very strong cards? And I think there's something to be said for just having good cards in your deck in a format like this.
Yeah, and that's like Evolution decks fall into that mid-range category, although I kind of put mid-range, just straight mid-range a little bit higher over Evolution decks in my evaluation, just because they don't have as many dedicated slots to a combo.
I think I agree with that. I think I would probably favor Evolution just because it's more my style. But I think you're probably right in that pure, not necessarily pure, but a more traditional definition of mid-range deck is probably going to be really strong.
Well, and I think something like Najeela really highlights this because the slots you really need dedicated to your win are real small. And also, Thrasios Tymna decks fall into that too. There is a world where you could build a Thrasios Tymna deck without Razaketh, without Isochron Scepter, without Hermit Druid, and just play, Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation, and you will be a really good deck.
Yeah, turns out when your commanders are both value engines and you can get to your win conditions pretty quickly, you get to do some good stuff.
Yeah.
Whoever would have thought, right?
Right. But Playem, he's he's out of Norway and he's had tons of success on Sans Black Evolution. He's wrote a lot of, I don't know if he's on primers. He has several lists for these Thrasios Bruce decks. And like you said, it's really good card quality. And these Advantage Thrasios decks just are going to have success.
And speaking of success, one deck that's been seeing a lot of spotlight lately, which is, to me, the spiciest deck on the database, Krakashima Clones.
Yep. That is Ken's boy. He calls it what? Siskel and Ebert.
Siskel and Ebert.
It is picking it here is certainly a choice. But and to quote Ken, he said, "I will pick it at 9 because I'm a coward." But in his defense, there is certainly plenty. Like, this is one of the things to defend him for a moment. A lot of people were looking at the draft format and being like, "Oh, well, 32 people are going to draft 4 decks, and after 32 people, there's not a lot of good decks." I mean, I've run a lot of simulations on this draft because I'm a crazy person, and you are going to get at least 2 to 3 excellent decks, and then one deck that will be from like okay to garbage tier. And
to that
like
point, if you've ever watched a Pokemon draft league, you know that sometimes it makes a lot of sense to draft the best bad Pokemon. And if you're expecting that there's like 64 very, very powerful decks and you're happy getting any 2 of them, I don't think it's completely crazy to pick a deck that you expect to go later, but you think is better than all of the other later decks.
Is certainly better. It's also a deck that he is very comfortable with,
which really carries a lot of weight.
It does. He literally wrote the primer for this deck. So if any, like, there's only a couple people that I could see potentially drafting that. Phoenix is one of them, because Phoenix also is in that server and does a lot of like testing on that list. Whether he wants to play like Manual Storm is a whole nother question. But it's certainly a greedy pick, taking your favorite deck that high that probably won't get picked until maybe 3rd or 4th round. But I'm not going to say it's a bad pick, because I mean, it's still a decent deck and it's going to get wins. And here's the biggest advantage, probably in a normal tournament setting, less so here, is it's super confusing to play against.
It really is. The mental fatigue is crazy.
It really is. And so there's a level to this deck of your opponent's not really understanding the lines because it is a fringe deck. Now, he will probably get some of that advantage in his division, just because some of the people in his division probably aren't as familiar with it, with the exception of like higher. But he's in a very like high IQ division, so I might be wrong there. But I don't know. It's a good deck. It's really good going out of first. You just got to mulligan well, so we'll see.
Yeah, last up for the top 10, you got Scoots on Razakats. Very strong deck. Scoots has shown a propensity for it in the past. I think this makes a lot of sense.
It does. It's a deck that he's very familiar with, but there's another added layer to that, which is he really, really, really doesn't want Lurker or Spleen Face to have it. And because if you think it's Scoots' best deck, it's Lurker and Spleen Face's absolute best deck. And so you really don't want it to fall to 13, and you definitely don't want it to fall to 17, because those are 2 players who are going to get the most, mileage out of them. So him picking it here at 10 feels safe. If Timmy decides to draft this, I could see a world where Scoots goes to CST, but I think at that point he'd probably consider something else, something that he probably thinks is a little bit more powerful, but we'll see.
All right, that does the top 10. I'm going to go off script for a minute and pose you a question, Callahan.
Okay.
You got 2 decks, one that you think is going to be a surprise hit, one that you think is going to be a surprise flop. What are they? Okay. I got 2 in mind if you want me to go first.
I need the deck lists in front of me because I put them away. So, hold on. Let me draft table. There it is. So I actually talked about a surprise hit. I was talking about this the other day. Is there's stuff on the database, specifically some lower colored decks that I think are going to do really well. I actually think Shaper and Whimsy's Thought Lash Grand Arbiter the fourth deck is going to surprise people if somebody drafts that and picks that list. It's really, really good. It's really strong. And I think it might surprise people how well that attacks Nas decks, and how good that is. I would also say like 5-color control with Kenrith control is also really, 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 really good. And I fully expect that to win at least one game, but I think the 100-minute timer does kind of work against that deck's game plan, so we'll see. As far as decks that fold, that you would expect to do really well, but might not do as well, is I know I've talked up a lot about Rog Silas, but like I said, outside of that home game, it's gonna struggle, and you're probably gonna not want to play that only 2 times because it's a fairly decent deck, or maybe you get stuck on something because you're going first and you have the first and the last pick in the draft. So, depending on where you pick it at, it could either be really good or really So I expect that to be a good deck in turn 1, and then you're going to see how bad it is outside of that. But I also think we're going to see Nas decks just overall not do very well, honestly. I think they're going to try to go on turn 1 and keep really greedy hands, and good experienced players are going to keep good hands in seats 2, 3, and 4 that are mid-range decks that are going to be able to deal with whatever they're doing. And I think Nas is going to have a bad season.
I think that makes a lot of sense. You want to hear my takes?
I absolutely do.
These are one lukewarm and one blazing hot. My lukewarm take, I think Brea is going to be a pretty good performer. You already know the Grixis shell does good things, right? It's got good cards. It has a lot of win cons that can overlap pretty well. If all things fail, you can back up onto Oracle Consult lines pretty well. It doesn't have a lot of hype going on for it lately. It's been really overshadowed by things like the Roger Silas. But I think it's still a very, very solid, above average, don't count it out sort of deck.
Right.
And I think it's deserving of the comparatively less attention it's gotten recently. I don't think that's surprising, but I do think it deserves a pretty good nod for this format because it's a lot of good cards that make up a pretty familiar shell to everybody at this point.
Yeah, and especially if you're really comfortable on like these Timnachrom ones, and you don't get to get a Timnachrom deck or those sorts of things, like Brea is a really nice consolation prize.
Yeah, it's kind of the same thing, just with less card advantage.
Right. The downside here is it's a deck that gets shut down by Null Rod pretty hard.
Very.
And it's a big, it's going to hurt really bad if you're playing Brea and you're playing it up against some of these mid-rangey decks and they slam a Null Rod on you, or what I think would be more likely is like a Collector Oof, actually.
That's what I was thinking, because that one makes you cry salty tears.
Yeah, if you see a Collector Oof, it's going to be a bad time if you're Brea, especially because Brea Consultation, these 4-color Nas decks that are like Sans Green have been pretty interaction light, so I don't know that they would have great ways of removing a Collector Oof, and that's a big oof for me. But I do think you're correct. I do think Brea Consultation will be a surprising deck for a lot of people, where it's going to look a lot better in this format than maybe in like regular EDH.
Yeah, for sure. And for my hot take that gets me kicked off of this show immediately.
Okay.
I don't think Gitrog is very good in this format.
I would agree with you.
I think it's very good at doing its thing. It's probably like a tier 2 home game deck. It doesn't go as fast and as explosively as like a Roger Silas, but it can definitely get going. The problem is you really have to know the deck in order to make it go off with any sort of consistency. And, don't get me wrong, all of our players are definitely top notch. They know what's going on. But if you're in a point where you're thinking you need to draft Gitrog because it's the strongest deck left by a lot, but you're not comfortable on it, you really got to do your homework, or you really got to pray that you got a good opening hand.
Honestly, if I was in that position, I would just pass on it.
I wouldn't. I would actually be doing a fair amount of work to stay off of Gitrog.
Yeah, there are some players here that I expect to at some point end up on Gitrog.
Oh yeah, if Scoots gets Gitrog, I would not be surprised at all, because Scoots has more hours on Gitrog than I have in Magic. So
Scoots might take it. One thing to keep in mind, and I think another player, this is on kind of his watch list, is Snacks is very into Gitrog.
Yep,
he's drafting at 27th. And so I would expect that if something like the First Sliver or something like that falls down there, which probably will, I expect Snacks to probably grab up like a Gitrog here. And Snacks is very familiar with it. And I did my big board last week, my top 25 decks in the format. And I put Gitrog at 23. And I do think it's one of the top 25 decks, but I have it low on that list because it just... you need so much knowledge.
It's a demanding deck.
Yeah, it's a deck that you really got to know. And Razakets is that way too, but Razakets 2 also has like Thoracle Consult, so kind of alleviates a lot of that.
Yeah, sometimes a safety valve is nice.
Yeah.
All right. Well, speaking of things you need to know, we're going to go have a quick interview with Josh from Second 7 MTG, see what their thoughts are coming into this conference and see where they stand. So let's throw it over there.
All right. So Josh, okay. So what's your last name exactly? I always see you as Josh Fran, but it's Josh. Is it Francisco or?
That is it. You guessed correctly. Josh Francisco, born in 1995.
Wow. Okay. And you are from Second 7 MTG. That is the YouTube channel that you started. And so kind of looking into that, you started that channel not terribly long ago. What kind of prompted you to start making competitive EDH content?
Well, so first I want to mention that I knew I wanted to get on the internet somehow. I have a different YouTube channel with a few super terrible workout videos. And editing those was awful. It was so boring. I love working out. Gym is a 6 days a week kind of vibe for me. But it wasn't something I wanted to sink my time into as far as YouTube for fitness was concerned. And I got into Magic content. I've been on the Play to Win Discord server for quite some time now. And someone mentioned that they wanted to see something more of a first-person perspective of a game. So the cards in hand and thoughts throughout the game on certain mistakes or tutor targets or targeting this player for the Gitaxian probe on turn 0 or whatever, something like that.
Right.
Turns out that takes a lot of time.
Yes, it does.
But that was, all those extra steps take a lot of time. But that was kind of my, this person is right. I don't see that kind of content. Let's try to do that thing. I'm going to release a video next Tuesday. And that first video is not great, but it got a bunch of views because it was a new Turgid deck right when the card was revealed, and it was right at release date. So that video actually did surprisingly well, especially looking back on it now. And I mean, every content creator, everyone with anything ever looks at this, but, this is the first time I did this thing. Wow, that is terrible. Looking back on it, of course. But yeah, that's kind of how I got into it.
That's awesome. Been enjoying seeing you grow as you started making content here recently. Next kind of thing for you is, as we look at the game and how you kind of got into Magic and really got into competitive EDH.
Yeah, as far as getting into Magic, I mean, I think everyone kind of starts with, kitchen table. I own Magic cards. Let's learn the basic rules and play one land per turn and beat each other with 6/6 worms.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just kind of how that started in 2013 with my friend Dakota from work. And it was a bunch of 60 card. We own some draft chaff Magic cards, and that's all it was until I stopped playing when I joined the Navy in about 2016.
Mm-hmm.
And I was doing school for the Navy. I'm a nuclear electronics technician on submarines.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so I was going to school for that, and that took up, 60 to 80 hours a week. So it turns out Magic is not high on the priority list at that point.
Right.
Once I got to my submarine, I found some other fellow nerds in about 2018. And so that, why do you have that card off in that area to the side? Your deck looks really big. That's definitely more than 60 cards. Oh, we're playing Commander. Oh, what's Commander? And so I slowly started playing with them. And it was very mid power at the time, and every once in a while someone would buy a new card, and oh wow, Jason, you have a Mana Crypt. That's a pretty sweet card. That feels really good. That's a really good card. So then kind of over time, our play group slowly started going higher and higher power. And not necessarily cEDH at that point, but definitely high power. And then in November of last year, when I moved to San Diego, on top of the COVID nonsense and everything, and moving to a new place, I wanted to find a community to play with, and cEDH Nexus was the first place that I found, and glad I did. And that's how
a great place.
Myself. Oh, absolutely. From high power to cEDH was once I joined the Nexus.
Awesome. There's a lot of really good people over there. I know, like Scotty is one of the people that we know from over there. But yeah, that's awesome that you were able to get in there. It's always interesting to hear people's journeys and how they get here. Everybody's got different paths. Speaking of paths, we do have the MLC season. That's, what we're doing this for. That is coming up, and the draft on May 1st. Your first game, not until, May 8th or May 15th. But, that's coming up right around the corner. And so, as a newer cEDH player, somebody who's kind of getting into it, it kind of feels like this is your rookie season almost. What is your game going in to the season?
So looking at the cEDH deck list database and your list of draftable decks, this is the first draft I've ever been in. I don't do like any of the sports fantasy drafts. I had to look up who Mel Kiper was. The conversation on the Discord channel is very insightful to learn who Mel Kiper was. But so drafting is foreign to me, true novice when it comes to drafting and even Magic tournaments. But I copied your draftable decks into my own Excel spreadsheet, and I kind of added my own column of, so I have adaptive, reactive, and proactive, and then combo, combo, mid-range, stacks, and control. And I kind of gave one of each of those words to a deck, and I'm kind of going to try to spread out what decks I have out of the four that I have. Obviously, decks 3 and 4 are kind of a grab bag of what's left with what you're comfortable with, but trying to spread out what decks I have, but also because I haven't been playing cEDH for, I think we're coming up on 6 months now by the time the tournament starts, but I haven't played all of the archetypes on the decklist database.
Right.
So playing some crazy Jund nonsense with Razaketh and Dargo like a couple weeks ago when I was practicing, the lines just weren't coming to me, and I as I'm looking at the cards in my hand and the cards in my graveyard, and like, I think I'm there. I don't know how to get there, but I think I'm there. And so my table is fantastic, my local play group, and we would talk through things. So I'm just going to try and spread out what decks I have as far as archetypes, but also play something that I'm comfortable with, just because I'm not the greatest cEDH player. 32nd place, here I come.
Well, I don't know about that. We'll see. You and Sage are both the two California people in your Pacific division, and you will have to play against them. Securia, who's on the other side of the world, but filling in for us over here, and Cameron, from the Lab Maniacs. So you've got a little bit of some different people in your group. As far as your game plan for kind of trying to decide what decks are going to be played, what is your game plan for choosing your decks each week?
Yeah, I haven't thought too much about that, but it's mostly just going to be, I guess week one is kind of going to be kind of out there, but I feel like mid-range is going to do really well in the tournament. So I'll probably start with a mid-range deck just to kind of gauge a tournament environment. But then after that, I do plan on keeping tabs of what decks people run, so that by week 2 or 3 or 10 or 11, I can see, this person's already played this deck 3 times. They literally can't play that deck again, so they're only going to play one of these 3 decks. And they haven't played this 4th deck at all yet. So there's a pretty high likelihood that they're going to play that deck. Let me run this stacks deck that will absolutely just shut that deck down, regardless of what stacks piece I get out. So a lot of research on my end based on what the other players have done so far.
Right. Well, very interesting. I'm really excited to see exactly how the season pans out for you. We will be keeping track of you and the other 31 players in this year's Major League Commander season. Thank you so much for sitting down with me, Josh. It's been a pleasure getting to chat with you, and good luck.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right, and we are back. That was a lot of fun. That was a good little interview there.
Yeah, Josh is somebody who is kind of an up-and-comer here in the cEDH content creation, community. So I wanted to take a moment to highlight him and really see what his game plan is going to be coming into this season.
All right, on. And with that, I think that about does it for today. So from another newcomer to the cEDH scene, myself, in terms of content creation, thanks a whole lot for joining us. Make sure you like, subscribe, and comment on the video. Believe me, it helps a lot more than you would think if you've never done content creation, so we'd greatly appreciate that. And speaking of ways you can help more than you know, head on over to patreon.com/themindsculptors. A lot of work has gone on behind the scenes. You guys don't see the sweat Callahan is dripping right now, but they've put so much work into this. And if you want to show your appreciation, that is one of the many ways that you can do so. So head on over there. And if you've done all of that, then we got nothing else for you. Good night, everybody.